This video was produced by
We are going to get started. A wonderful turnout. Thank you for coming on this beautiful, it's kind of beautiful outside, right? It was beautiful, now it's not so beautiful. Anyway, thank you for coming. Great turnout. I wanted to say a few things by way of introduction. This is the JMuse Café event, the last of the season. My name is Michael Trocchia. I'm with the JMuse Café Committee, which is a library-led event program. This year, well, every year we put on an annual theme. This year, that theme has been demystifying the expert. And at each of those events, we paired professors, science professors here at JMU, our experts, with comedians from JMU's new and improv group, the Comedy Troupe. The intention behind this pairing has been to demystify the language of the sciences, to open it up to folks with various educational backgrounds and interests, not just those studying science. And I can say we've had a lot of laughs and learning at these events, and we've had fun and informative exchanges between the experts and the comedians. Though this evening's event departs from that format, we don't have comedians, although I can attest that Professor Levinovitz has a good sense of humor. It shares with it an aim to demystify. The central topic tonight, of course, has to do with information about our diets, the vast information out there about our popular diets and food aversions that we see today. And Professor Levinovitz, who I'll introduce in just a minute, scrutinizes that information in his new book, The Gluten Lie and Other Myths About What You Eat, which is available there, as you may have seen by the entrance there. The book, it's actually officially in stores next week, so you can pick up a copy early here tonight. The aim is to demystify much of the pseudoscience, as still discussed, that has, let us say, clouded that information. And I'll let him talk about that. So, you would not be here if this topic wasn't important to you. And there will be a portion of tonight where we'll hear your thoughts, your reflections, your questions, and we want this to be a conversation. Professor Levinovitz will begin that conversation for us, raising some important distinctions and giving us some food for thought. Let me just give you briefly the format for this evening, so we're all on the same page about how things will unfold. As I said, Professor Levinovitz will get things started for us. Then we'll provide 2 prompts to you all for you to reflect on and discuss at your tables, or what you'll do is you'll kind of maybe bring your chairs together and have a little chat about these discussions, about these prompts. Then we'll have you kind of report out. We probably won't hear from every table and every group, but we'll hear from some of you, some of the things that you're discussing based on those prompts. Then we'll have a larger conversation where you can ask anything, share anything, any concerns, any questions, and have an exchange about what we're here today about our diets, how we see food, and the role they play in our lives. So, without further ado, let me introduce Professor Alan Levinovitz. I'm very pleased to have him here. He's the Assistant Professor of Religion here at JMU. His academic work focuses on classical Chinese thought, the philosophy of play, and the intersection of religion and medicine. As an undergraduate, he studied philosophy and religion at Stanford, and he received his PhD in religion and literature from the University of Chicago Divinity School. Alan's writing has appeared in Slate, Wired, the LA Review of Books, The Believer, and The Millions, as well as academic journals. He lives in Charlottesville, Virginia, and his daughter, and daughter, and a cat. Fake cheese is his one food taboo. So please join me in welcoming him.
Wow.
Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate all of you being here, and I apologize somewhat for the sensationalist cover and title, though I try to get myself out of it by declaring that I had very little to do with that. It turns out that publishers are interested in stirring up controversy more than they are in accurate representation of the contents. So don't judge the book entirely by its cover, and I hope today to, as Michael said in his wonderful introduction, open up a conversation about why we have come to believe the things that we do about food and about the seemingly contradictory information that comes out nearly every day in the news media about what we should and shouldn't eat. So I'm going to start by hoping this remote works. Let's see. I'm going to start with this iconic Time magazine cover. Cholesterol, and now the bad news. I think for many people in this room, this cover represents one of numerous food taboos that have determined what people eat. So I know that my parents, when I was growing up, avoided eating eggs. They wanted to watch their cholesterol. For those of you who actually looked into what had cholesterol, you might have avoided shrimp. Turns out shrimp have a lot of cholesterol as well. But if you've been following the news, you may have also seen this recent headline. The US government is poised to withdraw long-standing warnings about cholesterol. Hooray! Because it turns out that now scientists and the people who are authoring the dietary guidelines for the United States have concluded that eating cholesterol, in the form that it comes in eggs or shrimp, doesn't necessarily contribute to the higher cholesterol that worries doctors. So if you've been avoiding eggs, it was all in vain. Now, this brings up a point that's crucial throughout this conversation, which is that if you've done something like avoid eggs, if you've made a sacrifice, if you've changed your life, it is unpleasant to believe that that sacrifice might have been wasted. This is something that economists call a sunk cost bias. In other words, you bought the ticket to the movie, you went in, and it turns out Fast and the Furious 7 is just not what you wanted. But you stay because you've paid that money and you want to believe it's worth it. And you think to yourself, well, maybe it's really not as bad as it is. I should probably stay here, right? You don't want to admit to yourself that you've wasted the money you're already in. So if you hear that cholesterol is now good for you, there's a part of you that's going to say, oh, no, I really don't want to believe that because it means I could have been eating eggs my whole life. What have I done? But it turns out that it's not just eggs. I hate to say it. Scientists are now also saying that the government has been too draconian with salt regulations as well. So there is a growing consensus among scientists that, in fact, the amount of salt that the average American eats, around 3,300 milligrams, is fine. You've been avoiding salting your food for nothing? No one wants to believe that, right? And in fact, professional organizations have their reputations at stake. So, when a study was commissioned by the CDC to study how much salt is too much salt, the results came back. Turned out the CDC's recommendations were wrong. They were too draconian. The amount of salt was too low. The CDC said, we don't like the study. The AHA said, we're going to keep our regulations in place. Why? Well, we don't really like the results of these new studies. Sunk cost bias applies to organizations as much as it does to individuals. So, sorry, the remote is not quite as fluid as I'd like. By now, you guys are just used to seeing these contradictions all the time in the headlines. I've got up here, why raw honey is good for you. Healthy? No, honey can be worse for you than sugar. Meat and cheese may be as bad for you as smoking. but actually healthy eating, the case for eating steak and cream. And then, in the same publication, Scientific American, 2009, Americans are eating too much salt, Scientific American, 2011, it's time to end the war on salt. What in the world is going on here? Why are so many reputable scientific organizations issuing contradictory recommendations about what we ought to eat? With incredible confidence, too, right? It's not like the AHA says, oh, I don't know, maybe cut down on salt. We're not too sure. They say you definitely need to cut down on salt, you're going to die. Right? Absolutely. This is for sure. We know it, except someone else says that they don't. It's very confusing, and I think a lot of you feel like I do, a sort of dietary whiplash. What am I supposed to eat? It's important. You want to live a long time. You don't want your arteries to clog. You've heard that cholesterol is bad. It's very, very frustrating, and you become invested in the sacrifices that you've made. It gets even worse. Sorry, I'll redeem this, sort of, at the end. I'm not going to redeem this remote. Please go to the next slide. It's not just official government guidelines or nutritional organizations, it's also popular diet books. So I have here, for those of you who are familiar with these books, you'll say, oh, I know these. And one of them is Forks Over Knives. This is a diet book that recommends eating vegetarian as a way of reversing heart disease. So it recommends a diet consisting of plants, whole grains, and it eschews eating meat. In fact, the central premise of this book is that meat and meat products are the cause of most chronic disease. It's an enormous bestseller. Dr. Oz endorsed it. He had the authors on his show, and he said, you all need to read it. It's super important. But then we also have Grain Brain, another enormous bestseller, which lays all of the blame for those same chronic diseases on precisely the whole grains that are a key part of the Forks Over Knives plan. In fact, in Grain Brain, it is argued that you need meat and saturated fat to live a healthy life. Author David Perlmutter on Dr. Oz. Dr. Oz says, you really need to read this book. Okay, what are we going to do? What are we supposed to eat? Are we supposed to avoid grains because they cause chronic illness? Or are we supposed to avoid meat because it causes chronic illness? It seems like there's just no way to decide what to eat. All right, I'm going to try to help us a little bit. But first I have to explain what I'm doing here. This is the question I got from virtually every scientist and doctor who I interviewed for this book. Levinovitz, you're a professor of Chinese religion. What in the world are you doing writing a book on nutrition? So I told them all the same story. I told them about the grain-free monks of ancient China. I specialize in Taoism, and it turns out that long before David Perlmutter advocated avoiding grains, there were a group of, they're not Taoist monks for those scholars in the room, but monks that would eventually lead to what was called organized Taoism, who engaged in a practice known as bigu, which is literally avoidance of grains. So the 5 grains were a staple in the Chinese diet. These weren't gluten-containing grains. Some lists include wheat, but most of the lists of the 5 grains do not include wheat. And what these monks said was that if you avoid eating that terrible, conventional Chinese diet that includes the 5 grains, you will live perhaps forever, be able to fly, be able to teleport, which are separate things that I did not realize until I was reading the Chinese. I was like, no, it is. They're different. Flying's fun, at any rate. So you can fly and teleport. Your skin will clear up. And I'm thinking to myself, this is amazing, right? I just want to share with you 2 actual quotes just in case you think I'm making this up. So from a classic Taoist text called the balpouzza, is written in the first person. He says, when I inquired of people who had been doing without starches are the 5 grains, for a long time, they replied that they were in better health than when they were eating starches. When they took thistle and nibbled mercury, and when they also took pills of brown hematite twice a day, this triple medication produced an increase in breath so that they gained the strength to carry loads on long trips. It's unbelievable, right? 2,000 years ago, there were some grain-free monks who said that if you just avoid grains and eat proprietary dietary supplements, you will become incredibly healthy. Except it was just as bad back then as it is today. Because you wait a little bit longer, and in another Taoist text, it says, eating everything is not as good as eating vegetables. In other words, the absolute worst thing you can do is eat meat and vegetables. Better to be a vegetarian, but eating vegetables is not as good as eating grains. Now, it also turns out that eating grains is not as good as eating mushrooms and tree fungi, and eating mushrooms and excrescences is not as good as eating gold and jade. We're not going to get into that now. But suffice it to say, there was just as much contradictory dietary advice back in ancient China as there was today. What's going on? Well, now the doctors and scientists I'm talking with are interested. I see. Maybe there's something to taking a different perspective on why it is that we come to believe certain foods are healthful and certain foods are harmful. Except wait, isn't there a big difference between us today and those monks? After all, the monks are basing their dietary practices on religious revelations. They don't have modern science. Dean Ornish is a doctor. Dean Ornish does studies. Dean Ornish is different from a monk. He's a doctor. Paleolithic diet, which we'll get to in a second. Opposite, of course, of the vegetarian diet, which doesn't allow you to eat meat, but we'll get there. Also, supported by doctors, supported by scientific studies. Of course, you have to ask yourself, well, then all the studies are saying different things. What's going on there? But at the very least, aren't we different from ancient monks who based their beliefs about food on religion? I think you can see where this is going. The answer is no. We're not. So I want to talk to you about a myth. It is the most famous myth in the world. It's in the Quran, it's in the Christian Bible, it's in the Hebrew Bible because it's in the Christian Bible. And because the West has popularized this myth around the world, it is for sure the most famous story that anyone has ever heard. And what's it about? A dietary fall from grace. That's it. That's the most famous story in the world. A long, long time ago, humans lived in a divinely designed, organic, all-natural, GMO-free, pesticide-free garden. And they were immortal. And they were blissfully happy. And then an evil advertiser came along and said, eat this food. And they did. Bam. Mortality, labor pains, marital strife, and agriculture. Turns out that exact same myth exists in Chinese culture. And those monks who told people to avoid grains used the same story. Nowadays, in modern times, everyone's sick and sad. But back in the old days, before agriculture and these terrible grains, everyone was happy and they could teleport and fly and they had clear skin. And then the later monks, the ones who thought that you should avoid meat, they used the same story too. Back in the day, we didn't hunt and we were happy and there was no strife, and then people started hunting and everything went to hell, literally, right? We fell from grace and we ended up in this corrupt, sickened world. But we don't use this to justify diets, do we? We do. So, when you secularize the myth of the fall from dietary Eden, what you get are stories about people like the noble savage. You replace Adam and Eve with secular versions of unmodernized people. After all, what is it that Adam and Eve did? They became modern. Do we have examples of non-modern people? Yeah, the idea of the noble savage has been with us for quite a while, and it turned out that people have been romanticizing the noble savage. This is something I talk about in the book for a very long time. So there's a famous doctor who's also founding father who argued that Native Americans didn't suffer labor pains at all. Got to be a little suspicious. Really? No labor pains at all? It's amazing, right? And then what happened? Well, we moderns started suffering labor pains. This doctor was also a Puritan, so he was very, very familiar with the story of Adam and Eve, and it made him come to some very unlikely conclusions about the pre-modern people that he lived with. I mean, after all, look at those guys. They're ripped. If we just ate like them, we'd be so happy and healthy. Another substitution for Adam and Eve and the noble savage is Paleolithic Man. Long ago, in a time when everyone was healthy and lean and happy, there was no agriculture, and there wasn't this terrible American diet, everyone was strong and ripped. And then what happened? We came along with our terrible foods and our evil advertisers, and we fell from the nutritional Eden that was occupied by insert whatever person you want to romanticize here. Unfortunately, it's exactly that story that leads to all of the contradictory evidence that we hear about which diet works today. Because if you happen to pick a noble savage that subsists almost entirely on vegetables, you're going to make that your ideal diet. And if you happen to pick a noble savage that subsists largely on roots and tubers, you're going to make that your ideal diet. And if you pick one that subsists largely on hunted meat, you're going to make that your ideal diet. And since ultimately there is no common denominator between all of these different romanticized populations that help us retell the Eden story, but in a secular way, there is very little consistency among advocates of these diets. All right. This kind of bias towards a natural, happier, earlier, better world plays into the marketing of products. You see here raw protein. Of course, why is raw better? Because it's natural. Until we humans come along and cook stuff, why are we ruining things? Back in the day, before we didn't cook things right, so if you hear about the raw diet, you get the exact same kind of narrative going on. Here you also see, for those of you who can't see this, it's an amazing package. It's got every single myth I want to tell you about emblazoned on it. So you see it says the Garden of Life up there, sort of secretly reminding you of the Garden of Eden, right? And it's got raw protein. It's beyond organic. That's actually the brand name for this packaging. Then at the bottom you see it's vegan, it's gluten-free, it's dairy-free. But it's also scientific because it says vitamin code, fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. So what you have here is myth wrapped in scientific rhetoric. Do vitamins exist? Sure. Does that mean that we should go out and buy raw protein beyond organic protein formula? Not so sure that it does. So, I'm going to get to gluten, I promise. I know all of you in here are like, what's the deal with gluten? I'll get there. First, I want to start with MSG. A long time ago, before anyone knew about gluten, there was a different dietary demon. It was called MSG. And instead of gluten-free signs on everything, you saw no MSG signs on everything. MSG was labeled by doctors as a silent killer. Everyone knew that it caused migraines, and it caused chronic illness, and it caused Alzheimer's. It caused everything that you're scared of. So what happened? Scientists said, okay, let's look into it. Because it turned out that the entire MSG scare was started by one letter to an editor of a medical journal by a Chinese-American doctor named Robert Homan Kwok, who said, you know, I get this numbness in my arms when I go out and eat Chinese food. I don't know what it is. 6 months later, a study came out in Nature magazine that definitively identified MSG as the culprit. There were headlines everywhere. People were terrified. Letters poured into the medical journal that Robert Homan Kwok had written to, and they said, I have the same thing. There were neurologists saying, I had a patient, he just keeled over from a stroke. The guy was totally healthy, but he ate Chinese food the night before. So what happened? Well, the scientists studied it. And now here's where it starts to get sensitive. And I'll talk about why it gets sensitive. Because of all the stuff I talked about before, when you've invested yourself in a belief about dietary practice, it becomes an extremely personal thing. And I'll talk about why it's so personal and why people hate me all the time when I talk to them about these things. Because you don't want to believe that it's possible that you might be wrong about the effect that a food has on your body. So what do scientists do? They run double-blind, randomized controlled trials. They give people MSG. They give people food that they say has MSG in it, but doesn't. And it turns out, this is from the most recent edition of Food Allergy. It's a reference manual for hospitals and physicians, that, quote, there is little doubt about the rarity of the MSG symptom complex, even among individuals who believe themselves to be MSG sensitive. Now, I guarantee you that in this room, there are people thinking to themselves, well, maybe for those people, but not for me. I know it. I go out to Chinese food, I eat that stuff, my arms turn red, my face swells up. This is crazy. Maybe there are some people who think they're sensitive to MSG and aren't, but not me. Well, I'm going to take a step back from nutrition. I'm going to tell you a story about something called wind turbine syndrome. An MD PhD named Nina Pierpont published a study on something she called wind turbine syndrome. Wind turbine syndrome is a terrible condition that happens to you when you live near wind turbines. So the electromagnetic vibrations from the wind turbines mess with your head, and they give you terrible headaches. They make you dizzy. This came out. Lo and behold, lots of people started reporting that they had wind turbine syndrome. People wanted to install wind turbines in towns, and other people would say, no way, I know about this wind turbine syndrome. It was reported everywhere. People were absolutely certain. Here's the funny thing about wind turbine syndrome. It only happens in English-speaking countries. You see, Ms. Pierpoint's study has not been translated. When studies are conducted on wind turbine syndrome, it turns out that there's absolutely no one who has it. The scientific community has come to a complete consensus that wind turbine syndrome is bunk. And the reason that people in non-English speaking countries don't experience it is because they have never heard of it. Now, there is no denying the existence of wind turbine syndrome, and there is no denying the fact that when you are told that something can harm you, you will experience symptoms just from being told that. Now, the question is, might this not also apply to foods? If anxiety about a wind turbine can make you sick, then can't anxiety stoked by the countless nutrition gurus and fearmongers who tell us that there are hidden poisons and secret killers lurking in every single place, and we have to avoid them if we are to ever survive and not get Alzheimer's and not come down with coronary artery disease, and really if we want to be strong and ripped? Well, if that's the case, and I just want you to go with me on this, if it's the case that we might have something like wind turbine syndrome going on at least for some people, okay, so if you're getting really angry at me right now, and I know you are, please, I'm not saying it's all in your head yet. What I'm saying is that for some people, it seems pretty likely that something like this is going on. It's a solid hypothesis. Why? Because according to a systematic review by a Stanford epidemiologist, very famous Stanford epidemiologist, done some very interesting studies. I'm going to show you a second one in a moment. Everything is associated with cancer. So he just did a systematic review of 53 common ingredients in cookbooks, and it turns out that you can go into the scientific literature and find out that all of them either cause or cure cancer. But when he looked more closely at those studies, he found that associations with cancer risk or benefits actually highlight implausibly large effects, even when the evidence is weak. In other words, whenever you see a study about something causing or curing cancer, it's probably not true. In fact, Ioannidis' most famous paper, one of the most cited papers in the history of science, is called, helpfully, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. The conclusion of the study is summarized in the title. And what he says is that for many current scientific fields, so this is in science now, claimed research findings may often be simply accurate measures of the prevailing bias. In other words, when you see studies coming out about certain foods being harmful or certain foods being healthful, they don't necessarily reflect scientific truth, but they do give you a pretty good picture of the kinds of myths that people have already subscribed to. I promised I'd get to gluten, so here we are. Is it dangerous? Am I telling you that you're wrong? No. So the first, absolutely number one, most important thing that I want everyone in here to understand is that there is a condition called, some of you know where I'm going with this. Go back. There is a condition called celiac disease. It is an autoimmune disorder in which the protein complex actually that is gluten causes you to react in various ways. There's all sorts of different symptoms. The cause of celiac disease was discovered a long time ago. You get all of this in my book by a researcher named Willem Dick, who was really interested in figuring out whether or not nutrition could treat his patients with celiac. He was a pediatrician. He eventually realized that it was gluten that was causing their reaction. He eliminated gluten from their diets, and it turned out that celiac disease resolved. This is a very serious condition. Even minute amounts of gluten can cause a reaction. There is no such thing as cheating when you have celiac disease. All of the celiac disease researchers that I spoke with encouraged me to tell whoever I gave talks to, and in my book as well, to tell people to get tested. If you think you have celiac disease, get tested. It runs in families. So if one person in your family has celiac disease, it is entirely possible that someone else might as well. And if they're asymptomatic, they could go on eating gluten their whole lives and put themselves at a higher risk for things like infertility and certain kinds of cancer, among many, many other disorders. So it's really, really important to understand that celiac disease exists. Okay, that's 1% of the population. But a third of Americans are interested in going gluten-free. What's up with that? I'm going to take you back to that myth of the evil fallen present and the wonderful paradise past. So in another book called Wheat Belly, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, a cardiologist named William Davis talked about how nowadays we have this crazy new wheat called Franken wheat, and it's been modified, and it's scary, and it's a monster, and the reason that you are feeling sick and tired and nauseous, and the reason that you are fat or whatever it is that you're afraid of or dissatisfied with, it's this modern super gluten that's in this terrifying Franken wheat. What is Franken wheat? Well, this article answers, it's a term used to describe the modern wheat Americans eat today. While our ancestors, you can hear the myth here, right, mostly ate einkorn wheat, decades of crossbreeding and hybridization to create high-yield crops. And I want to point out here that the implication is that there is an evil, evil deity called Big Food. It's stepped in to replace the devil. And it's the thing that is tempting you with these scary, processed, cheap, horrible things. And it is the reason that you are suffering. And it has created a shorter, stockier, dwarf wheat that now makes up almost all the wheat we can consume. And I can tell you something, I've run into people who have bought into this American thing because they go to Europe and they say, you know, I react to gluten in America. I go to Europe, I can eat all the bread I want. It's amazing. Now, all of the scientists I've talked to uniformly tell me that there is no magical paradise where gluten reacts differently when you are in Europe. There's no difference between American wheat and European wheat. People will say, well, it's GMO. Turns out there's no GMO wheat, period. So we'll talk about these narratives in a moment. We'll have a chance for a group discussion. At any rate, the experts I've talked to, at least scientists I talked to, told me that it's really important to understand there is no difference. Why is it important to understand that? Because if you do have celiac, don't believe for a moment that you can go to Europe and start eating bread. Science doesn't work like that. Gluten is gluten. It's a protein complex. It reacts with you. And this idea that there's some kind of romantic, pre-modern, better, healthier kind of gluten that won't react with us as much is just another version, I'm arguing, of the same myth that we've seen occurring again and again. But what about Dr. David Perlmutter, renowned neurologist, author of Grain Brain? I'm just a professor of religion. What do I know? He's a neurologist. He's had people go gluten-free, and they've turned around their whatever, insert chronic disease here, right? Well, I hate to do an ad hominem attack, which is an attack on someone's character. But it turns out that that's not always a fallacy. In philosophy, sometimes you can engage in ad hominem attacks where undermining the reliability of a source makes you want to question what it is that they are telling you. So, and this is why we have, for example, in scientific studies, conflict of interest declarations at the bottom, right? So ad hominem attacks are built into how we process science. If you are reading a study and it turns out that the person who produced the study is selling the thing that the study says will help you, you want to know that. Well, I'm going to take you back 15 years to the beginning of Dr. David Perlmutter's career, to his book, brainrecovery.com. The title of his book is also a website. It's a self-published book that linked to his website, and in this book, he promises that he has the cure to Alzheimer's disease, to multiple sclerosis, to memory loss, stroke, Parkinson's disease, post-polio syndrome, ALS, and more, because he can't get them all in on the cover. Here's the funny thing about Perlmutter's book. He's got a new book coming out. I encourage all of you not to buy it. It's called Brain Maker, and in that book, he makes precisely the same promises based on cutting-edge research on the microbiome. Here's the question I want to ask you. How can you make the same promises 15 years ago if all of that cutting-edge research wasn't around? The answer, of course, is that there's a gigantic conflict of interest in promising people miraculous dietary cures. And there is a rhetorical strategy for selling books like Grain Brain and Wheat Belly. And it involves exaggerating the state of the scientific consensus to hawk whatever diet it is that you want to sell to the public. Every single scientist that I talked to whose studies were cited in these books told me with great frustration that they hated them, that they were taking their conclusions out of context, that it was pseudoscience, and that most people who can't get behind the paywall or don't have the time to call the researchers and find out what they actually think would be taken in by those deceptions. One of those people is Peter Gibson, a leading researcher at Monash University. He's a gastroenterologist. His studies on gluten are widely cited in the media. He is cited by David Perlmutter. And it turns out that Gibson ran a study that showed that gluten caused gastrointestinal symptoms in subjects without celiac disease in a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. When this study came out, it was a bombshell. There was really, really clear research that showed that for some people, non-celiac gluten sensitivity was a reality. Now, it's worth pausing and noting that what this study also showed, and what Peter Gibson emphasized to me, is that most of the people who participated in the study and thought they had gluten sensitivity reacted to placebos. A reaction to a placebo, which we'll get to in a moment, is called a nocebo effect, where it gives you negative symptoms. So it makes you feel worse because you expect it is going to hurt you. So in these studies, uniformly, people who thought they had gluten sensitivity reacted to placebos and felt worse. But there was a small percentage of them that reacted in a way that made Gibson think that there was actually something in a small percentage of the population called non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Except, the exact same lab came out with another study, this is the exact same team, mind you, that says no effects of gluten in patients with self-reported non-celiac gluten sensitivity after dietary reduction of fermentable, poorly absorbed, short-chain carbohydrates. I can't get into all of that right now. What I want to show you is that the lab came out with two seemingly contradictory studies. The first one showed that there really was something called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and the second one showed that there wasn't. So I asked Peter Gibson what was going on. And he said, he's very frustrated. He said, people said the researchers in Australia have changed their minds. They don't understand what science is. We just produced more data. You don't come into research as an evangelist, and I like his choice of a religious term. Otherwise, you start to misinterpret your own data. We're just looking for the truth. And the truth right now is that we've just scratched the surface. That is the state of the field. Anything other than that is exaggeration. And remember, exaggeration in science is a lie. Please work. So I have a little cartoon here. I drew it. First thing I've ever drawn, thank you. I'm not going to go into this as an occupation, it turns out. So I have there's placebos. Many of you can't see this. On one side, there's regular placebos. On the other side, there's gluten-free placebos. The caption says they cost more, but I've noticed a big difference. Pause for laughter. Thank you. So what's going on here is that we know in scientific studies that placebos can produce benefits, right? This is why we have to have randomized, double-blind, controlled trials of things, because people improve when they think they're going to improve. Expectation of improvement causes you to improve. But there's also an equally proven effect called the nocebo effect. What happens with the nocebo effect is that when you think something is going to produce harmful effects, you feel them. The nocebo effect is prominent in nutritional studies. It is prominent in studies of lactose intolerance, of allergic reactions, and, of course, it is prominent in studies of gluten. So what am I saying? I'm saying that although the case is still open about whether or not non-celiac gluten sensitivity exists in a small percentage of the population, experts estimate that if it does exist, ranges from about 1% to 6% of the population. There is no need for anyone who is not in that population to avoid gluten. This, again, is the consensus of all of the researchers that I've talked to. There is no need to believe fearmongers like David Perlmutter and Wheatbelly, who are wrapping myths in science to sell their books, to rescue you from a nutritional hell that they themselves have created, and that believing in these things might be as much a problem for some people as the things themselves. So what's in my book, and why should you buy it? Well, I don't just talk about gluten. I talk about sugar, I talk about salt, and I talk about fat, and it turns out that lots of myths and superstitions inform what we believe about what we eat, not just Paradise Past. So, for example, the idea that sugar is addictive, right? We finally, we figured it out, right? It's not cholesterol, it's not It's not fat. We were wrong about that. It's not all these other things. But we're pretty sure it's sugar. You think we would stop, right, and say, wait a second. Really? Are we that sure? Well, everyone's very sure. If there's one thing that everyone can get together and hate, it's processed, modern, evil sugar. Remember, not honey, because that's natural. Evil sugar, because it's processed, made by evil big food corporations. Well, here's a funny thing. I'm not going to give everything away. This is a cartoon from 1909 that shows death at a soda fountain serving women and children, because long before we ever had scientific evidence that sugar might be, not conclusive at all, might be linked to diabetes, before we had anything approaching an obesity epidemic, people were already demonizing sugar. You know what they thought it did? They thought it made women and children too sexual. And if you go back even further, when sugar first appeared on the scene in the West, along with coffee and tea, it was blamed for causing scurvy. Now, our fears have changed a little. We're no longer Puritans, so we're not scared of over-sexualizing women and children, and we no longer have scurvy, so we're not blaming sugar for that. But the same trope of the addictiveness of sugar and the evil of its processing appears again, wrapped in the scientific rhetoric of today. So in 1909, you bet there were scientists explaining very scientifically how sugar caused women to sleep around. I promise you, it's in the book, right? And if you go back to 1800, there were people telling you how the science of the day, except back then it was humoral medicine, they were telling you how sugar caused whatever it was that they feared. So what I talk about in the book are all of the different myths and superstitions that have informed our beliefs about food, which, when it comes to the actual science, are pretty darn uncertain. It's incredibly hard to study nutrition. At the end of the day, we just don't know a whole lot about food. We know some things, though. I'm going to leave you with a somewhat redemptive graphic. Here's what we know. I'm not going to make a lot of money on this diet book. Don't smoke cigarettes. Don't eat too much. Eat everything in moderation. And for the vast majority of people, you're going to be just fine. Those pork rinds back there that hardly anyone touched, because I know how you feel about them. When I went over there, there was this sort of aura emanating, right? It's like the craziest, worst thing. You eat that and it just goes directly to your artery, right? But that's just not how it works. That's not the science of it. You are what you eat is a myth. It is magical thinking, right? So in ancient China, how did you treat impotence? I apologize. You treated it with using tiger penis elixirs, right? Because in almost every religion, there is a myth that if you consume something, you will absorb its properties. That's the exact myth, to take you back to the beginning of the presentation, that made people avoid eggs. Because if you eat cholesterol, it's going to raise your cholesterol levels. You are what you eat, except that's not true. You aren't what you eat. This, unfortunately, is all that we know. Now, for people that are in a minority, people with celiac, people with allergies, it's extremely important to recognize that we should be incredibly grateful to modern science for the advances on which there is a consensus and which have helped genuinely save lives and improve people's health. But as for the rest of it, I encourage you, at the very least, to be open to the idea that perhaps, despite the sunk cost bias, despite the importance of the narrative around which you have tailored your eating habits, that just perhaps you might be wrong. Thank you.
I want you at your tables maybe to discuss. I'm going to pull out some prompts for you. You can use those prompts, but I'm sure you have your own things you probably want to discuss anyway. But gather around each other. Whatever questions that were raised here for you, whatever anything that may have upset you, whatever you might find disagreeable, whatever you might find agreeable, discuss those things. And we'll hear from some of you, and then we'll open it up to a larger conversation for the last 20 minutes of the evening. So I'm going to pull those prompts out, turn to each other. There should be some scrap paper near you or whatnot in case you need to take notes, and have at it.
I'm afraid that he trivializes the importance of there are some things we shouldn't eat. And there are some things, and even if you're not in celiac disease, there's a lot of non-celiac gluten sensitivity going around, not because of GMO. It has nothing to do with GMO wheat. It has to do with genetically engineered wheat, which is not GMO. And we have genetically engineered wheat to be different than its original molecular structure, and that's not GMO. That's not what GMO is. So we have actually changed wheat, and what we've changed wheat to is something that wheat isn't supposed to be. And so our bodies are not reacting to what we would get if we were out hunting and gathering.
So how are our bodies reacting? I'm just curious. What science?
Inflammation.
What is that?
Inflammation.
Okay.
The number one reaction to things that our bodies are not supposed to eat is inflammation.
Right.
And inflammation is cancer causing, it's autoimmune disease causing. And so putting things in our body that nature didn't design, because we redesigned them in a laboratory, even if they're not GMO, is still not good for us. And so the kind of wheat we eat is what's causing a lot of gluten sensitivity.
But isn't anytime you eat, there is an inflammatory response by the body?
Anytime you want it?
Anytime you eat, there is an inflammatory response by the body.
But there are some things that cause an inflammatory response in the small intestines and the bowel.
Yeah, but every time you eat, you develop inflammation. Eating is an inflammatory process. And anytime you ate today, your body underwent some small scale of inflammation.
But eating organisms that nature hasn't designed brings about a whole new enhanced inflammatory response. If he tells enough people this and people dismiss their diets or their good intentions, I find that almost unethical.
I would have to absolutely disagree with that, because I have been over the past couple months to this doctor and this doctor and this doctor. This one tells me wheat's the problem. This one tells me dairy is the problem. This one tells me this is the problem. This one tells me I should eat like this. You can't all be right, and they all have their reasons about, well, it's definitely this because of this, and it's definitely this because of this. And I just that's why this was so interesting to me, because I'm you all are buying into something. You all have these claims that all your clients, when they eat like this, they feel so much better. And it's just I don't believe it when they tell it to me, and I don't think that it's changed the way that I feel at all. So you're not all right, when you tell your clients that this is the way to go, I don't think that can be a claim that can be broadened and made. I think that everybody's body is different. So for you to say there's one diet that's going to help everybody and that everybody's made the same and that everybody can't eat this, I just don't think that you can do that.
So I'm sure you guys, I hate to kind of rip you out of those conversations you were in, but we'll take the next 15 minutes or so, and if you have to leave right at 8, because I understand, don't worry, you can leave, but we may go over a little bit. So what I'd like to do is just hear from some of you on, some of the things, some of the questions you might have, again, some of the things you've been discussing with one another, given Alan's talk here. So we'll just kind of open it up to anybody. The first one's always, anybody, a remark, a comment? Yes?
Some questions. Do you think all of these bad myth things, do you think it has to do anything with some of the good stuff, like the whole superfood and kale stuff? Do you think it has to do with it?
You mean, do I think that the myths also produce the opposite of the dietary fears, or the panaceas? Absolutely. So there's a section of the book, purchase it on your way out, called Superfoods, Super Stupids, in which I trace the history, for example, of the goji berry. You'll be shocked. Same myths, same tropes. So in the same way that these things can cause us to fear things, they can also cause us to believe in cures, right? Remember the Taoist monks, if you eat a little bit of mercury and some thistle, you're golden. So, you don't want to eat mercury because it's a heavy metal, But it turns out, right, this is the funny thing. So Ayurvedic medicine, for example, which is a traditional Indian medicine, actually uses heavy metals to treat diseases, right? So what ends up happening when we romanticize alternative medicine traditions, this is something I'm more familiar with Chinese medicine, is we pick and choose. We're like, they were very, very wise, except for the heavy metal thing, right? Or I love the acupuncture, but not the exorcism, right? And so there's this way in which we romanticize certain things, but get rid of others. And we don't want to think about things like, so again, to take Chinese medicine, regardless of how you feel about acupuncture, I think people really put a lot of stock in it because it's 2,000 years old. But if you think about it for a moment, where were they getting the needles? They weren't, because there were no thin filiform stainless steel needles 2,000 years ago in China. Now, whether or not that affects your opinion on acupuncture is something else, right? But it's really important to stop the kind of, ancient wisdom thing, I think, is another one of those tropes that you get a lot. Hope that answered the question.
And I should say, we're going to be passing around a mic. The mic actually doesn't amplify you in the room. It's for the video recording. So another question or comment? We got one over here. Yes?
You mentioned towards the end of your speech that you are not what you eat. And I feel like that's a very strong comment to make, considering that there are many documentaries out right now, like, what was it called? Super Size Me, where he ate tons of McDonald's for weeks on end. And it obviously had an enormous change to his body. So why do you still consider you are not what you eat?
I see. So that's it. So it's funny because there's another documentary about a guy that was made in like a retaliatory documentary where he ate a lot of McDonald's and lost weight, which I think was a stupid documentary, but it's out there for whatever it's worth. You do know what I'm talking about? Yeah, a terrible documentary. But what I mean to say is not that what you eat has no effect on your health. That would be crazy. What I'm saying is that a simplistic model of what you are, what you eat. In other words, if you eat fat, you will become fat. Or if you eat a strong animal, you will become strong. Or if you eat an organic animal, you will be organic yourself, right? So the model of an innate transfer of the quality of the food to you is a misperception. Now, that's not to say that you aren't, influenced by what you eat, but it's really important to make a distinction between the two. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, yes. Yeah, no. Stop.
Do you think, maybe in your studies that you were doing in writing for your book, that there may be some basis or some truth in Ayurvedic medicine, and that what may work for some people may not work for others? Because my general understanding of Ayurvedic medicine is that there are different body types and different diets do well for different body types.
Yeah, so my short answer to that is that that's not unique to Ayurvedic medicine, right? So just normal doctors treat different people different ways. If you're elderly, for example, they will tell you to do different things and eat different foods than if you are a baby, right? No one's giving infant formula to me, at any rate, right? So what I would say is that there's this misperception, I think, that, and medicine is a very different thing, and I have a lot to say about that, but I think there's a misperception that there's like other traditions that honor the individual, while as this tradition just gives people whatever they want. That's simply not the case. And so is it valid? Is it important to treat individuals differently based on who they are? Absolutely, right? That's why people with celiac shouldn't eat gluten. But I can, right? At the same time, do I think there are serious problems with the epistemology or theory of knowledge that underlies Ayurvedic medicine? Absolutely. So, and that's a different discussion, and I think it's really important to like complicate that idea.
Yes, in the middle here.
What do you eat?
I promise I'm going to stop flogging my book. But one of the things that my editors kept saying to me is they said, you got to give people something. You got to give them a diet. I said, I gave him moderation. He says, it's not enough. You have to tell people what to eat. That's why people buy these books, right? So, and I said, but that's the whole point of my book. He said, I don't want to do that. He said, look. So I didn't argue with him because he's paying me. So I came up with a diet that I call eating in the fourth dimension. Because I actually didn't come up with that title. Another person who I cite in there did. But he allowed me to use it. So you eat in the fourth dimension. I eat in the fourth dimension. What does that mean? Well, most diets focus on 3 dimensions of food. The quality of the food. So is it organic or inorganic? Is it nutritionally dense or is it an empty calorie? Quantity of food, how much are you eating, right? And type of food, is it a carbohydrate? Is it a protein? Is it whatever? So I say just for a month, try eating in the fourth dimension. And that means not paying attention to any of that. You're not allowed to think about any of those 3 dimensions. You have to think about time, though. So what you have to do is you have to take time to eat. Time preparing your meal and time to sit down and eat it. So one of the things I say is you eat during time you have set aside for eating, not during time that you have set aside for something else. And I encourage people, I think, to do that, to take time with their food, to prepare recipes that they care about. And I think people will find that's what I do. That's how I eat, except for fake cheese, which is the devil's toe jam. But that's what I do. So I recommend taking your time with what you eat and caring about the food that you prepare. And I think you'll find that doing that is actually a really healthy way to approach food that reduces anxiety. So that's what I do.
We've got another question over here, if you would wait just for the mic to make its way. Thank you.
So as long as I take time to prepare my food and eat my trans fats and white carbs and CAFO meat and squished vegetables and salty stuff, it's okay as long as I take time to do it? Or do you actually advocate a different type of food when you're eating in the fourth dimension?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So if you go out and look for recipes, you'll be hard-pressed to find a recipe that calls for 5 grams of trans fat, 4 grams of squishy vegetables, and a pile of, what were the CAFO meat? CAFO meats and white carbs. CAFO meats and white carbs, right? So there are very few recipes out there. I challenge you to find a cookbook or a culinary tradition in any culture that calls for those things. So one of the things that you do when you're eating in the fourth dimension is prepare not ridiculous recipes, but recipes that come from your own culinary tradition or other culinary traditions. And what you'll find is that without thinking about any of those things, you won't end up eating them. So you don't actually have to be worried about the foods that you're eating if you take the time to prepare foods that people would care about, because there is no culinary tradition that embraces those foods. It doesn't exist. Does that seem like a reasonable answer?
Yeah, we'll go here and then we'll go in the back there.
So since you are a professor of religion, do you have a bias towards any religious diets or any thoughts on differences?
I see. Yeah, no, I'm biased against religious diets. So a Rabbi Joe, he's awesome. So I talked with a rabbi who I have come to speak to my classes. He's also very frustrated by religious diets, in the sense, obviously not frustrated by religious diets, he's a rabbi. But he says, look, being kashrut or kosher, right? It's all about a connection with a community, right? So you practice a ritual to remind yourself that you are Jewish, right? This is the point of the dietary tradition. And most anthropologists of food, they look at the Levitical prescriptions on food, and it used to be the case that people thought it was about health, like this was some kind of proto, don't eat pork because of trichinosis. Long discredited. The Levitical prescriptions are about categorizing certain foods. I don't want to get into this, but the point being that I have no problem with religious diets as long as you don't confuse them with healthy diets. And the rabbi is equally frustrated, right? You eat kashrut for the meaning, not because you want to lose weight or be healthier or do whatever. So I encourage people to eat vegetarian for ethical reasons, right? I mean, we don't get into the ethics of food here. Ethics is a very separate thing. If you are concerned with the slaughter of animals, if you are concerned with factory farming atrocities, whatever it is, I think there's very powerful arguments to be made for avoiding eating meat. But don't conflate what's ethically good with what's good for your health, which is another philosophical fallacy that I talk about in the book. We'd like to believe that's what's morally good is also healthy, but that's just superstition. It's not. Unfortunately, there are things that are physically healthy but morally repugnant, like, well, we won't get into this. So that's what I would say about religion.
Question in the back, and then we'll come back to the front. Yes.
So early on in your presentation, you showed how some of those recommendations that the government makes contradicts itself.
Yeah.
Do you think that the government should be making any recommendation at all for food and or passing laws like you shouldn't have a big soda cup or something?
Yeah. So again, and by now you've read 90% of the book. It's not true. You've barely scratched the surface. I promise, right? Don't you want to read about sugar and salt? You won't even believe the crazy salt cult at Duke University. No, it's insane. There's all sorts of intrigue. There's a corrupt. All right. So should the government issue dietary guidelines? I think it's irresponsible to issue dietary guidelines when there isn't very solid consensus on the science. I think it makes people anxious, and I think there are things that we can all agree on. Eating in moderation, trying to cook more, and getting exercise. I think the government ought to present a united front on those. And once we've conquered that and people are, there's some social changes we can make. Let's eliminate food deserts. Let's make more time for people to eat. Let's make sure that subsidized housing has a kitchen that's workable in it. I think that we really ought to focus on those things. And once we've achieved that, which I think would be amazing for everyone's health, then we can sort of nitpick the other stuff. But at this point, at least, I think confusing people with a lot of regulations is counterproductive. Yeah, it's controversial, but that's where I stand.
I'm loud enough that I probably don't need a mic. Okay. So one of the things that I found really interesting in your talk, and I'm excited to read more in your book, is kind of this rhetoric of where is this information coming from? And I shared with you before that when it really boils down to the core of the nutrition scientists, I feel that we feel, as a nutrition scientist myself, that we know that there are deficits in the literature. There are gaps in the literature. We know that there is very faulty science out there. And I think as far as the My Plate and government recommendations, I think that we're trying to give the best guidance that we can based on the evidence that we have at hand. And I will say I'm quite nervous as a registered dietitian about the new recommendations that are going to come out in 2015 regarding cholesterol. We're really going to turn this on its head. And we have a lot of work cut out for us health professionals in order to begin to align people with what is good for their diets right now. Yeah. And I think that that's a challenge because people want this information. They come to you and they say, well, what should I eat? And I have to do the best that I can with the science that's available. And I just have to trust that my nutrition science background, that I'm able to look at the evidence and make that critical distinction myself. So I think that that's very important for everybody to realize that not all nutrition people and people who are making these highfalutin recommendations don't see the gaps. We do see them, and we realize that. So we need better science. We need a better way to critically review our science. We need to prevent MDs, and I'm not just pointing out MDs, but people who don't actually know how to conduct science, to stop them from conducting science. And so that's kind of my answer to your rhetoric of where is this coming from. And we also have to stop the media from sensationalizing observational studies that come out in the literature. So anyway.
Yeah. And to say, I'm sympathetic. When you say should the government issue guidelines, I'm really sympathetic to the fact that what I'm saying is an impossibility, right? You have to give people something. And is that a pretty good recommendation? Yeah, I think it's fine, right? The problem is as soon as you put up that plate, it invites argument, and there's going to be people like, well, you can't trust the government. Look what they did before with cholesterol, right? And so it's hard, and I'm glad I'm not in charge of, coming up with the nutritional guidelines, because no one's, I guess it's politics, right? But no one's going to be happy with it, right? If you just issue a black plate with a circle that says moderation, people are going to think you're nuts, right? So I can do that, but the government certainly can't. At the same time, I actually think that, if I were emperor, I think that's not a bad way to go. Change public housing, make more time for people to cook, and encourage moderation and time for exercise, I think would be pretty great too. So. But I'm very sympathetic to the problems.
We've got a question over here.
In answering one of the questions, you said that it would be crazy to say that what we eat doesn't have an effect on our health. And I think we could both agree that some foods are better for us than other foods. Do you think that there is some sort of like platonic form of a diet out there that is like yet to be discovered, or do you think that just like moderation is the answer? Or, so I'm curious what you think about that going into the future, so to speak.
So the short answer is I do not think that there is a platonic form of the diet out there to be discovered. I think there are a lot of different ways to eat food healthfully. I think it's important culturally not to search for that platonic form. Food cultures are incredible, right? We have foods that we ate with our parents. We have foods that we ate with our grandparents. We have foods that we eat when we travel. And I think to seek to label foods as better or worse can be counterproductive for our lives as human beings, right? It's not just about maximizing health. So even if there were a platonic form of the diet that got you 1.9 years longer life than others, I think it would be sad to build our lives around that. You know, I don't like fake cheese. But, you know, my wife ate mac and cheese when she was a kid, and it brings back memories for her. And you know what? She makes it for our daughter occasionally. My wife's a chef. She's a baker. We eat phenomenal food, and we eat in the fourth dimension. But does she make mac and cheese occasionally? Yeah. Is that fine? Absolutely, right? So in that sense, I'm also leery of saying some foods are better for us than others. I mean, yeah, if you ate only Kraft mac and cheese every day, weird things, I'm sure, would happen to you. But can you have it every once in a while? And is it important to be able to? Yeah, I think so. I think the platonic form of the diet takes into account the beauty and richness of culinary traditions and our own culture.
Another question over here.
Yes. You mentioned briefly in passing the microbiome.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in your thoughts on the effects of a life of taking oral antibiotics on how you digest food and which foods and that part.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked. So I'm working on a hit piece about David Perlmutter, who has a book coming out about how you can, you know, manage your microbiome to live forever and fly and teleport. And so one of the things I did was I called up Jonathan Eisen, who's a microbiome expert, and I asked him, what do we know about the microbiome? And he said, well, we know very little, because he's an authentic scientist, so he doesn't lie. And he says, we really don't know a lot. We know it's important, and we know it's very complicated, and we know that there are certain things that are associated with reduced diversity of gut microbes. So antibiotics for children, especially, seem to be something that we might want to be more moderate about. There are other kinds of practices that seem associated with a gut microbiome that might be unhealthy. But notice all the qualifiers I'm using, right? We just don't know, right? So let me take you back to genomics, right? 10 years ago, we're going to cure all these diseases, and we know all this stuff about the human genome, and this is the smart gene, and this is the fat. Well, you know, what happened with that? Not a whole lot, because it turns out genetics is incredibly complicated. People overhyped it. They made a lot of promises. And here we are still trying to figure things out. So with the microbiome, you know, and again, I'm no expert, right? But the experts that I've talked with for this piece have said, we don't know a whole lot. We know it's really important. For sure, we don't know what a healthy microbiome looks like, period. End of story. We know that there are some microbiomes that have some associations with some things, but it's really hard to say. You know, so that's where we're at. Unfortunately, right, that's not what people want to hear. I mean, I'm not saying you don't, but like, people really want to know, I shouldn't take antibiotics, I drink kombucha, bam, like, you know, and eat some sauerkraut, and like, I'm set. It would be great. I wish I could tell you guys that. I wish I could tell you that eating sauerkraut would change your microbiome for the better, but we just don't know it. Now, you should eat sauerkraut because it's awesome tasting. But that's a separate thing. So yeah, that's what we know about the gut microbiome right now.
We've got time for one more question, right over there.
I really liked your comment on the eating in the fourth dimension. I think that's a really great idea. And being an Italian, I think hours about what I'm going to eat for dinner. So I was kind of going to extend a little bit further and ask for your thoughts on it. Do you think that time is really important, not just in cooking your food and eating your food, but also in the process of how we grow our food? So for instance, the amount of time a chicken needs to mature and grow up, or the amount of time we put into producing our vegetables, but also now the amount of time that we spend choosing our ingredients in the grocery store. What are your thoughts on those impacts of time?
Yeah, a lot there. So quick things. If you take more time, so part of preparing foods is selecting foods in the grocery store, right? And I think the more time you spend selecting foods, I mean, I lived in China for 2 years, and I would watch people spend great hours going through the cucumbers, right, before picking the one that would make their dish perfect, right? And I think there's really something to that. The more time you put into something, the more you appreciate it. The more you appreciate it, I think more likely you are to eat healthfully, but not healthfully in the most global sense of that word. With how much time we put into producing food, it's difficult, right? Because social class comes in. So I really don't want to be saying to people you ought to eat food that has had more time put into its preparation, because often what that amounts to is telling people you ought to eat food that you can't afford, or you ought to eat food that is unavailable to you. And ought statements often come associated with moral judgments. So if people think that they ought to be eating a certain kind of food but they can't, then they think worse of themselves. I don't think that's a good route to go down. It makes me even leery of telling people they ought to take time with their food, because I can say that, but what if I'm working 2 jobs and I got 3 kids to take care of? Who am I to tell that person that they ought to follow my diet, right? So on the one hand, yeah, I do think those things are good, but on the other hand, I think we need to be very careful and think about the way in which the kinds of recommendations that we make affect how people think about themselves and their world, right? The last thing you want to do is make people anxious when they don't have a choice to do otherwise.
I think on that note, I do want to note there are plenty of pork rinds in the back for you to grab. And but also in the back again. Also in the back, you can find Alan's book there at the table there. Thank you again for coming down.
I'm so grateful